So that's one part of our mission, is holding everyone together as a community, advocating for them, and then also advocating for their clients with them. So that's kind of unique to Cincinnati, and it's a really cool aspect of what we do. The second part of our mission is education, and our major education tool is Street Vibes newspaper. Has everyone bought Street Vibes? Everyone familiar with Street Vibes newspaper? All right. I'll be handing out free ones today.
Save you $1.
But if you see a vendor, buy an extra one, because it's incredible this month, so you'll want to share it with a friend. But we also do homeless curriculum. We get into high schools. We talk about homelessness, and in an effort to increase understanding, increase empathy, increase activism. And then the third part of our mission is advocacy, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. Alice mentioned we're working on some zoning issues, working on restoring human service funding, and then there is one more issue that's just come up and is in Street Vibes, and I'm going to ask Don Sherman from the Worker Center to come up and help me talk about that when we get to that part of it. Zoning. What happened with the zoning is it was caused by CityLink and opposition to CityLink. And Councilmember Chris Bortz decided that there was a problem with our zoning laws in regards to social services, and that the zoning laws needed to be changed so that something like CityLink couldn't happen again. Now, love it or hate it, I've got a real problem with politicians changing an entire set of rules just to target one agency. You know, I've got a real problem with that process. But then what ended up happening with it is that there were a lot of problems with the language. And this discussion about the zoning laws and what they were going to look like kind of happened in a vacuum. We would get the notice like the day of the meeting or the day after the meeting. So really there was a very small group of people who were working on these zoning issues, and most of them were motivated by their dislike of CityLink and were not actual service providers or people who were up on, you know, what the zoning needed to look like to effectively serve people in Cincinnati. So the language came out, and the first part, it was very vague. The language was, things were not defined, like dormitory housing, dormitory style housing was not defined. It was actually so vague that it would have impacted churches as well and faith groups who provide services. So if your faith group has a food pantry or does street feeds or whatever, you would have been under this zoning law, which was not the intent, but it was an unintended done. Unintended side effect because of the language being so poorly written. Another thing they said was that you could only have 50 people per facility, and that each person needed to have 50 square feet of space. Now, that's a great ideal, but unless you're putting the money behind it to make that happen, it's not economically feasible. And what would end up happening is the shelters would become too small and we would have people on the streets. And then another one, they were going to grandfather in existing shelters. So they were like, oh, don't worry about it, you'll be grandfathered in. Don't worry about it, the YWCA. Grandfathered in, that means like if you're already existing, the law wouldn't impact your shelter. So they were like, oh, don't worry about the YWCA, don't worry about the drop-in center, that's not about that, they'll be grandfathered in. But the problem with grandfathering in is that if you want to expand your shelter, if you want to move your shelter, if you have a fire in your shelter, if you need to rehab your shelter, the grandfathering stops as soon as something changes like that. So it had the unintended side effect of locking shelters into place and keeping them where they are and making it so that they couldn't expand or grow or move or change. And then also they had a thing that you would need to get a permit if you offered more than one service per agency. And that was another very, very vague point in the law, and that included administrative offices. So you couldn't have your administrative offices in your shelter, or and we were asking a lot of questions about that. We were like, okay, well, what if you do life skills training and drug treatment and you provide beds? And they were like, well, that's more than one service. So it was just really poorly written and bad. And it put it on hold to find out more information. And they said, you know, we don't know enough, we're going to find out more, we're going to bring more people to the table, we're going to do this right. And boards at that time said, oh, the planning department has stalled. and they are not effectively producing this. So he took it out of the Planning Commission, and he was going to push it through his committee and through for a full council vote that week. So we were able to stop that from happening, because the problem with that, obviously, is the language wasn't ready. And it wasn't ready to go before council. And it also, it was a subjugation of the process. You know, it's like, oh, you guys aren't, you guys know this or not, City Council hates public input. They hate it when we all come out and do our 2 minutes. They hate sitting there and pretending to listen. They hate it. And so, working fast enough, I'm going to take it away and make it be a council issue, instead of trusting the authority of the planning department, who was hired to make these decisions. So what we did is we had a press conference on the steps of City Hall. We got a lot of religious leaders who were, you know, concerned about the potential impact on their church, but also impact on people who they care about, the underserved in Cincinnati, social service providers, and everything else. We got a lot of people to come out to the meeting, and the rest of council, I don't know, the rest of council was pretty mad at Chris Bortz for putting them in that situation, because we had, you know, 50 people there wanting to do their 2 minutes, and they were all like, wait a minute, why isn't planning department handling this? And Roxanne Qualls raised that issue many times, as did Cecil Thomas, saying, put it back in the planning commission, let them do their work. And so what ultimately happened is all of this language was abandoned, and it did go back to the planning commission. So it was a victory. But for now, this is a big ... because what Roxanne Qualls kept saying, which I think she's absolutely right about, is, but if you are, I have the name and phone number so that you can be a part of the group that's kind of hashing out the details of this. This is a problem because it's subjecting the process. It's overriding the process. Once the process is complete, they can't guarantee that we're going to like what's in the zoning code. But that becomes a different issue. That becomes a different part of the process. But what we do have right now is community input. So I'm going to give, if anyone really into zoning code, love zoning code, want to participate in this discussion, I know, I don't either, but zoning code in the planning committee. So it was a victory for now, but we're waiting to see what they continue to come up with. And contrary, I don't know if you all read City Beat last week. I just read it yesterday, and I was so mad because at the very last part of it, Chris Bortz is like, well, the Homeless Coalition's not going to be happy with whatever we put out, and our job's not to please them. And I was like so irritated with that, because it's like, no, what we were having a problem with was the process. We might not be happy with the zoning code, but we want to have a seat at the table when we're discussing it, and that's what we're asking for. So if you read it, just know there's two sides to every story. So that was the zoning issue. Do you want to do like questions and answers after each issue, or do you want me to just go through what I got and then have a free-for-all at the end? Keep going?
Yeah, usually at the end.
All right, human service funding. I know a lot of you have been watching this. This first became an issue in fall of 2004. I actually had to go back through my archives and find out when all this started, because it started out as just like a little file that I thought would be over quickly, and now it's like a drawer in my filing cabinet, and it's just been going on and on and on. But the history of it is that for over 20 years, the city of Cincinnati has given 1.5% of the general fund to human service funding. And it's not even just homeless services, it's literacy programs, after-school programs. Just about every agency you could care about is funded through this human service funding. And it's a tiny little pot of money, it's 1.5% of the budget. But for small agencies, it means the entire world. And what we found is that our agencies are able to leverage the money from the city. They get $4 for every $1 the city gives them. So they're able to go to other funding sources and say, the city believes in us, we want you to as well, and kind of patch together their funding that